Good morning. Today we're looking at the Literary Informative Analytical Writing Packet. We're going to look at learning target number 5. What kind of voice is most effective in this form of writing? We're in the style section looking at the final style target, which is style number 6, to choose punctuation, words, and phrases for an effect. Now, as we look at this learning target, please date it today's date, but I will be looking at notes from a previous packet, and that was style 7 at that point in time. But ours in our packet is style 6. So words, phrases, and punctuation for an effect. Probably one of the most challenging types of concepts to look at multiple choice questions for. But when we are looking at it as making edits and revisions in our own writing, it can actually be a fun thing to do. So when we choose punctuation, words, and phrases for an effect, the effect is the why behind using that particular word, phrase, or punctuation mark. In other words, we have a reason for why we want to include it in our choices as we edit and revise, because it does something to make our writing better in some particular way. So as we are looking at that, maybe the effect is we want to influence the feelings of the reader by influencing the mood of the piece. Or maybe we change the word or phrase or punctuation mark to influence the voice of the writing. In other words, the tone of the writing coming off the page. Whenever we think about writer's craft and writer's choices for doing things, when we change words, phrases, and clauses for an effect, we're really looking at changing emphasis. Sometimes we emphasize or point out certain things more clearly, or de-emphasize, which means to not point out, to kind of hide. So de-emphasize means to hide it as the effect. Emphasize means to point out or draw attention to the effect we're looking at. When we look at punctuation for an effect, the marks that jump out to me are the dash, the parenthesis, and the exclamation point. So the rule behind the exclamation point is to avoid overuse of the exclamation point. They do emphasize what you use next to it by creating a sense of excitement. But when we use too many, it can be tacky and childish. So you want to avoid to only use them at the appropriate time and use them rarely. Because otherwise what you thought was going to point out or emphasize actually overdoes it and makes your writing come off as childish and tacky. The parenthesis is used to de-emphasize or hide information. Now, it's obviously still readable when you put something in parentheses, and it's right there in front of you, just like this target up here where you see the parentheses. But the only difference is that it really does lend itself to meaning the reader can sort of skip over it and kind of notice it later. You may in the past have skipped over words in parentheses rather than reading them in your textbooks. That's because the parenthesis tends to hide information. It tends to de-emphasize it right in front of our face. And then the dash. We've talked about the dash since the first 9 weeks. The dash points out. It's like an arrow. It points out whatever's next to it, emphasizing that clearly. It's sort of like a light up sign that points at the words next to it. So if you want to emphasize something and not do it in a tacky, childish, or generic way, use the dash. The dash is a great way to point out, to emphasize, to be like, hey, look at this first with information. When we're looking at words and phrases for an effect, we really want to consider the connotation and denotation of the words. The denotation is the dictionary definition, whereas the connotation is the feeling or idea the word gives you, which can be positive, negative, or neutral. Connotation is most closely with tone and mood. Some words that are more vivid have a better effect on the description of the writing as well. So let's do some practice with punctuation, words, and phrases for an effect. Read the paragraph. Mount Davis, located in Forbes State Forest, is the tallest mountain in Pennsylvania. This fact would be interesting on its own, but the height of the mountain of Mount Davis itself is only part of the attraction. At the very top of Mount Davis, at about 3,213 feet above sea level, is a rock. That's the highest point in Pennsylvania. Which revision of sentence 3 best uses punctuation to emphasize how high the rock is? Is it A, at the very top of Mount Davis is about 3,213 feet above sea level is a rock that at its highest point in Pennsylvania? Is it B, at the very top of Mount Davis at about 3,213 feet above sea level is a rock that's the highest point in Pennsylvania? Is it D, at the very top of Mount Davis at about 3,213 feet above sea level is a rock that's the highest point in Pennsylvania? Or is it D, at the very top of Mount Davis at about 3,213 feet above sea level is a rock that's the highest point in Pennsylvania? What's the correct answer? The correct answer in this case is D. Here's why. It's using the dash. We said that the dash is the way to emphasize information. It draws attention to it. It points it out. It makes it stand out. The only punctuation mark of the ones listed is the dash. In fact, as I read through all of them, they sounded the same. It was that visual appeal of the dash that made it stand out. So the dash is what we use to emphasize information, thus making that one correct. Let's look at words for an effect. Read the sentences from a person's description of a day hike. Lydia stood on the ridge and looked out at the craggy outcrop. It was a peninsula surrounded by air, a wall of rock that came to a point and fell 1,000 feet to the valley floor. At the top of the crag, Lydia spied a nest of eaglets. Just then she heard the sound of a scree, looked up, and saw an eagle flying in with a fish. Which revision of sentence 4 most vividly describes the event? A. Just then she heard a piercing scream, looked up, and glimpsed the eagle diving toward its nest of eaglets, with a fish dangling in its talons. B. Just then she heard a noise that sounded like a scream, looked up, and watched as the eagle had a fish and was coming down toward the nest. C. Just then she noticed a scree that came through the air, looked up, and saw a huge eagle flying around a nest and holding a fish with its talons. Or D. Just then she heard a loud scree, looked up, and happened to see a great bird holding a fish and quickly approaching its nest of smaller birds. In this case, the best sentence that makes it more vividly descriptive is A. Here's why. We have the word piercing used to describe the scree. So we have that very vivid word, piercing, making that effect of the moment more vivid. We also have this word dangling, a strong word that helps us visually appeal to that sense of sight about where the fish is located in the talons. In all of the other choices, you don't see the strong word choice being used for an effect with great verbs to help us visualize the event within the sentence, which is why choice A is the best choice. So keep in mind as you are writing to make sure that you are choosing punctuation, words and phrases, all for a specific effect. Use that dash to emphasize, point out, draw attention to information. Pick your words and phrases very, very carefully, helping to influence the feeling that you give the reader as well as the tone coming off the page. And ultimately make sure that as you make your corrections, you're doing them grammatically correct as well. So go ahead and practice this with a type 1.